The Price of Pride. On the 41st floor of the Whitcomb Tower, above the frozen ribbon of Michigan Avenue, the dining room called Cordelia's glowed like a lantern held over the city. The chandeliers had been blown in Murano and shipped across an ocean in crates packed with straw. The tablecloths were pressed twice a day. A pianist in a charcoal suit played something soft near the windows, and 30 stories below him the headlights crawled through the December slush, while the people up here drank $40 glasses of Bordeaux and never once looked down. Walter Prescott had built all of it. He had built it out of a single griddle in a bus station diner 4 decades earlier, and he had named the crown of it after the only woman he had ever loved. Cordelia had been gone 11 years now, ovarian cancer, diagnosed in April and finished with them by October, so fast that Walter still sometimes reached for her in the dark before his hand remembered. She had made him promise 2 things at the end: that he would keep feeding people who were hungry, and that he would not let the money turn their 2 children into strangers. He had kept the first promise every single day, standing near the marble column by the host stand that night, in a plain gray suit that cost less than the wine. He understood that he had failed the second one completely. "Brad, come look at this," his daughter said, loud enough that 2 tables turned. Vanessa Prescott was 29 and beautiful in the expensive, weaponized way of a woman who had never once been told no. She was pointing across the room at a man near the service entrance, a big man in a canvas coat gone shiny at the elbows, who had come in from the cold and was standing very still by the coat check, as though he already knew he did not belong. Her brother turned in his chair. Bradford Prescott was 33 and wore a suit that fit him like ambition. He looked the big man up and down and smiled. "Sir," Brad said, "the shelter is 9 blocks south. This is a private room." The man in the canvas coat lowered his eyes. "I was told," he said quietly, "that a man could ask at the back for a plate. That the owner sometimes—" "The owner," Brad said, "would like you to leave before you frighten the paying guests." He raised one finger toward the maitre d'. "Or should I call building security and let them walk you to the elevator?" By the column, Walter felt his hands close slowly into fists. He watched his son humiliate a hungry stranger in the middle of the restaurant he had named for his dead wife, and he watched the guests at the near tables laugh into their napkins, and he did not move, because a thing had been forming in him for months, and it had just, in that instant, finished becoming a decision. "All the money I gave them," he thought. "Every door I opened so they would never freeze the way I froze at 19. And it did not make them kind. It rotted them from the inside out. And I stood by and let it happen, because grief made me generous in the one way that costs a man nothing. I made 2 people who point at the hungry and laugh." He turned before anyone could see his face, and he went to find the stranger a meal himself. The kitchen at Cordelia's ran like a warship, 40 covers behind on a Friday, and Walter moved through it the way only a man who had once scrubbed its floors could move, sideways and unhurried, touching a shoulder here, tasting a sauce there. At the pass, he plated a bowl of the night's short rib and a heel of the sourdough they baked at 4 in the morning, and he carried it out the service door himself into the concrete cold of the loading dock, where the big man had retreated to stand under a sodium light, with his breath smoking in front of him. "Here," Walter said, "it is not much. It is what we are serving tonight." The man looked at the bowl and then at Walter, and his eyes went bright and wet. He said his name was Eli. He said he had worked framing houses for 19 years until a scaffold gave way in Rockford and took the strength out of his right arm. And then, one thing after another, the way it goes, took everything else. He said he had not eaten since Wednesday. "Come to the back door tomorrow," Walter told him. "Ask for me by name. Ask for Walt. Do not bother." The voice came from the service door. Brad stood in it with his arms crossed, and behind him, half a step back, was one of the young servers, a woman with flour still dusting her forearm and an apron she had not had time to change. "You do not get to hand out the inventory to every vagrant who wanders off the street," Brad said to his father, not even bothering to lower his voice in front of the stranger. "Do you know what a plate like that costs us at menu price? $68. For him." Eli set the bowl down on an overturned milk crate as gently as if it were made of glass. I am sorry, he said. I did not mean to cause trouble. And he turned to go back into the cold. Stay, said the young server. Her name was Grace Monroe, and she stepped past Brad into the dock with her chin up. And she pressed something into Eli's hand before anyone could stop her. It was a fold of cash, small bills warm from her apron pocket. Grace, Eli said, because he had seen her before, at the back door, on the nights the manager was not watching. This is your tips. You cannot. Money comes and money goes, she said, and she closed his fingers around it. Go get yourself a room tonight. It is going down to 9 degrees. Brad watched her do it with an expression of pure disbelief. When Eli had gone, he rounded on her. The people who eat here have taste, he said. They have class. If you would rather play Saint Grace of the Alley than keep your job, I can arrange the career change for you right now. Yes, Mr. Prescott, Grace said. Her voice did not shake. But her eyes, when they lifted, were not a servant's eyes. And Walter, watching from the shadow of the doorway, saw the whole of it. He saw his son threaten a woman for the crime of kindness. He saw the woman refuse to be smaller than she was, and he made a note of her face, and of everything he already knew about her, which was more than she imagined. He knew that Grace Monroe was 26. He knew she had a younger brother named Cole, finishing his first semester at a state school on loans she co-signed. He knew that her mother had started chemotherapy in October at a hospital that had already sent a bill for $11,400, and that Grace worked a double every Saturday and picked up the shifts nobody wanted, and that she had never once, in 3 years, been late. He knew because he read the personnel files himself. It was the last thing a man in his position was supposed to do with his time. He did it anyway. Not all of it is lost, he thought. Not everyone under my roof forgot how to be a person. And quietly, painfully, in the cold with his breath smoking in front of him, he began to lay out the plan that would cost him more than money. That same night, after the last guest had been poured into a town car, Brad and Vanessa cornered their father at the corner table by the windows, the one where he liked to sit after service with a cup of coffee and the ghost of his wife. Brad had brought a leather folder. He set it down and slid it across the linen. You still have not signed, he said. Walter turned the folder over without opening it. He knew what was in it. A voluntary transfer of managing control of the Prescott Hospitality Group, 9 restaurants and a catering arm, and the license on the Whitcomb lease, from a father to his 2 children, in exchange for what the lawyers called a dignified emeritus role, and what Brad called getting out of the way. I have been thinking about it, Walter said, and the honest answer is no. Why? Vanessa said, not even looking up from her phone. No offense, Dad, but you are 63. You are not in your prime, you lost a step. Everyone in the group can see it. Walter looked at his daughter for a long moment, at the fine bones she had gotten from her mother, and the boredom she had built herself. Then I am sorry to disappoint the both of you, he said. Because as long as there is breath in me, I will do what I think is right with what I built, whether it pleases you or not. And what I think is right is that the 2 of you have forgotten every single thing that matters, and that I am the one who taught you to forget it. Brad's jaw tightened. So we just wait, he said, while you run this into the ground feeding bums on the loading dock. You embarrass us. Do you understand that? You embarrass the name. You should be humbler than you are, Walter said softly. Both of you. You are not half as far above that man in the canvas coat as you believe. And then the pain came. It came the way Cordelia had always feared it would, a fist closing around the left side of his chest, the room tilting, the pianist's last chord stretching long and strange. Walter gripped the edge of the table and felt the coffee cup go over, felt the warmth spread across the white linen, and then the floor of the restaurant he had built came up slow to meet him. And he was down among the table legs with one hand pressed over his heart. Dad, Vanessa said. Her voice climbed. Dad. Brad was on his knees beside his father in an instant, but he was not loosening the old man's collar, and he was not calling for the ambulance. He was going through Walter's jacket with quick, practiced hands, inside pocket, breast pocket, and when his father's eyes found his in that swimming dark, it was not grief Brad's face held. It was arithmetic. The combination, Brad was saying. Dad, stay with me. You never gave me the combination to the vault. The one downstairs, the recipe vault, the master ledger you never. Where is it? Just tell me the combination, and then you can rest. All right, just tell me first. I thought you had it, Vanessa said somewhere above them. He never gave it to me, Brad hissed. He never trusted me with it. Dad, the numbers, please. The numbers, and then you can go. Around them, the staff had frozen in the doorways with trays still in their hands. Grace had a fist pressed to her mouth, and Walter Prescott lay on the marble under the Murano light in the restaurant named for his wife, and felt his own son's hands searching his pockets for the key to the money, while the warmth was still in his body, and he closed his eyes, and he let the darkness take him. He would remember it every day for the rest of his life. So, though it would take them far longer to understand, would his children. The funeral was on a Tuesday. It snowed. 200 people came, chefs and vendors and line cooks and a United States senator, and Brad gave a eulogy about legacy that made the business reporters cry and meant nothing at all. Vanessa wore black Chanel and checked her phone during the homily. By Thursday, they were in the offices of Prescott's estate attorney, a lean and unhurried woman named Eleanor Prine, who laid a sealed folder on the table and folded her hands on top of it. "We can begin the reading," she said. Finally, Brad said, and glanced at his watch, a steel Patek that had been a gift to himself. "I have a call at 11. "We are waiting on the other beneficiaries," Miss Prine said. Brad laughed. "There are no other beneficiaries. We are his children. We are the only family he had." There was a knock, the door opened, and into the walnut hush of that law office came Eli, the big man from the loading dock, in a borrowed sport coat with the sleeves too short, and behind him Grace Monroe, twisting her hands, having taken the morning off a shift she could not afford to lose. "Good," said the attorney. "Now that we are all present," she broke the seal. "I, Walter James Prescott, being of sound mind," she read, "do hereby revoke all prior wills." And she read on, "Pass the small bequests, the pension for the dishwasher, who had been with him 30 years, the scholarship fund," until she reached the paragraph that stopped the air in the room. "I leave the controlling interest in the Prescott Hospitality Group and the operation of the flagship restaurant, Cordelia's, to two people who reminded me, when I had forgotten, what my wife made me promise. To Eli Turner, and to Grace Monroe, whom I name general manager of Cordelia's." "This is a joke," Vanessa said. Her voice had gone thin. "My father would never." "I am sorry," said Miss Prine, and she did sound sorry. "I drew it myself. It is airtight." Brad was on his feet. "This is insane. He left the empire to a bum off the street and a girl who carries plates. There is more. There has to be more. He would not have dared put us on the street." "He did not," said the attorney. She turned a page. "In the codicil, your father was very specific. Bradford Prescott and Vanessa Prescott retain the family name and a place to live, on one condition, that they accept employment as members of the cleaning and dish staff, under the new management of Cordelia's, for a period of not less than 1 year. I would rather starve," Brad said, "than pick garbage in that place. I was born to run it. I was not born to take orders from a busboy and a saint. I am sorry to spoil the alternative you are forming," Miss Prine said mildly, "but your father also directed that all personal and trust accounts in your names be frozen until the year of employment is completed and verified. There is no purchase you can make. There is no lawyer you can hire that I have not already anticipated." He thought about this for a long time. Vanessa had gone very white and very quiet. But Brad stood there in his $4,000 suit with his father 11 days in the ground, and what came across his face was not grief and was not shame. It was a cold and total certainty that a mistake had been made, and that he was the man to correct it, whatever it took. Across the table, Eli looked at Grace the way a man looks at a door he is afraid to walk through. And Grace looked back at him, and neither of them said a word, because there were no words yet for what had just been placed in their hands. Cordelia's reopened the following Monday. Grace stood in the middle of the empty dining room an hour before service in a manager's blazer that still had the fold lines in it, and Eli stood beside her turning his cap in his hands, and the staff gathered in a half circle the way they used to gather for Walter. "I do not know how to do this," Grace said to them honestly. "I know how to run a floor. I do not know how to run all of it, but I know how he did it. He knew all your names. He knew your kids' names. So we will start there, and we will figure out the rest together. And nobody, she said, and here her voice hardened just slightly. Nobody in this room gets talked to the way some of us have been talked to. Not anymore. The old line cook, a gray and enormous man named Sal Rourke, who had been at the griddle since the bus station days, folded his arms and studied her and then nodded once, which from Sal was practically a standing ovation. Then the service door opened and Brad and Vanessa came in, dressed down and furious, having spent the weekend burning through every attorney in Cook County and finding every one of them, exactly as Eleanor Prine had promised, a dead end. How humiliating, Vanessa murmured, scanning the room, as if terrified someone she knew might see her holding a bucket. Grace turned to them. Her face was not cruel. That was the thing Brad could not stand, later, when he replayed it. She was not cruel at all. Good, you are here, Grace said. Vanessa, you are on the dining room floor and the restrooms. Brad, you are on the dish pit, back of house with Sal. Aprons are by the walk-in. We open in 55 minutes. The dish pit, Brad said. The dish pit, Grace said, and walked away to count the drawer. Vanessa lasted longer than anyone expected, which was to say she lasted the way a person lasts who has run out of other options. She cleaned the restrooms with 2 pairs of gloves, and her face turned away. And she wept quietly in the walk-in cooler where she believed no one could hear. And she told her reflection in the mirror over the sinks that her hands were not made for this, and that the industrial bleach was ruining her skin. But she showed up. Every morning at 10, she showed up, and something in that, though she did not know it yet, was the first brick of a person being rebuilt. Brad did not show up in the same way. Brad showed up to make everyone pay. On the 3rd morning, Sal set a rack of 200 wine glasses beside the sink and told him, not unkindly, to keep them moving because the floor got slammed at 7, and a dry glass was the difference between a good night and a bad one. Brad looked at the rack and looked at the old cook, and picked up 1 glass and turned it in the light. When you talk to me, Brad said, you look me in the eye. Do you understand? Son, Sal said, I have washed more glasses than you have drawn breaths. Look me in the eye and pick up the sprayer. Brad set the glass down. Then, with one slow, deliberate sweep of his forearm, he pushed the entire rack off the counter, and 200 glasses went to the tile in a bright green crash that stopped the whole kitchen. Now I do not have to wash them, Brad said into the silence. Grace came at the sound. She looked at the sea of broken crystal, and she looked at Brad, and she did not raise her voice, which was somehow worse. That is $900, she said. It comes out of the year. You just added weeks to your own sentence. She turned to Sal. Get him a broom. I do not take orders from you, Brad said. This is still my family's name on the door. Then honor it, Grace said, and walked away. Brad quit the dish pit that afternoon. He could not, of course, quit the terms of the will, so he found the one lever left to a man with nothing but spite and a frozen trust fund. He could not be the owner, so he became the customer. He came in that very night and took the best 2 top by the window, Walter's table, and he snapped his fingers for a menu, and he ordered half the kitchen and sent most of it back, and he left a single dollar folded into a triangle as a tip, and he did it the next night and the night after that. He requested Vanessa's section every time. He made his own sister carry him 14 plates and then complained that the sourdough was cold, that the Bordeaux was corked, that the service in this place had really fallen off since the ownership changed. He smiled the whole time. It was the smile that frightened people. At the pass, Sal watched him do it and shook his head. The old man, Sal said quietly, to no one in particular. No wonder his heart gave out carrying those 2 all these years. It was 2 days later that Vanessa broke a different way than her father had. A regular had come in for lunch, a heavy-set woman in a good coat who tipped well and always ordered too much and apologized for it, and Vanessa was assigned the table because she was the only server not already buried. The woman ordered the braised short rib and the roasted chicken and a side of the truffle potatoes and a Caesar, and then added, with an embarrassed little laugh, a bowl of the tomato bisque, because she was watching her weight and did not want the heavy things to sit wrong. Of course, Vanessa said through her teeth. We would not want anything to sit heavy on you. Eli, who was bussing nearby because he could not stand to be idle, asked if she needed a hand with the tray. Vanessa told him she was not helpless. She loaded 14 pounds of china onto one arm, the way she had watched the real servers do it, and she took 4 proud steps toward the window. And then, the whole architecture of it slid, and the short rib, and the chicken, and the truffle potatoes, and the tomato bisque went down the front of the heavy-set woman, and across the floor in a ruin of white porcelain. "My lunch," the woman cried, more startled than angry. Grace was there in a heartbeat, all apology, promising to replace everything, comping the check, sending over dessert. And she turned to Vanessa and said, "Lo, apologize to her." "Apologize," Vanessa said, and something in her, the old thing, the rotted thing, reared up one last time. She should apologize to me. If she did not order enough food for a family of 6, none of it would have fallen, because it would not have weighed 100 pounds. The dining room went quiet. The heavy-set woman's face crumpled, and she reached for her coat with trembling hands. And that was the exact moment the door opened, and a bright, cold voice said her name across the room. "Vanessa Prescott. Oh my God, is that you?" It was Sloane Whitaker. Once they had been inseparable, 2 girls with the same highlights and the same contempt. And now Sloane stood just inside the door of Cordelia's in a shearling coat that cost more than Grace made in a month, taking in the apron, the sauce down the front of it, the bucket by the wall, with an expression of perfect delight. "Sloane," Vanessa said, "look at you. You smell like a kitchen. Where have you even been? Nobody has seen you." "My father died," Vanessa said. "There is a thing with the estate. It is complicated, I heard." Sloane's eyes glittered. "I heard he left it all to the help, so now you are the help." She laughed, a bright silver sound, and she pulled off one glove and let it fall to the floor at Vanessa's feet. "Well, since you work here now," she smiled, "pick that up." Vanessa looked at the glove. "Sloane," she said, and her voice cracked in a way it never had. "Please, do not." "Pick it up, maid," Sloane said. "Leave her alone." Eli had crossed the room. He was not a big presence in the ordinary way. All his size had gone quiet in him during his years on the street. But he stood between the 2 women now, and there was something in his face that made Sloane take an actual step back. "Money does not buy you the right to grind a person under your shoe," Eli said. "It never did. It just makes some people think it should." "Excuse me, and who are you?" Sloane said, recovering her sneer. "I do not know why I would take manners from somebody who looks like he sleeps under a bridge." "I did," Eli said. "For a while. It taught me more about people than your whole life is going to teach you." He bent and picked up the glove himself and held it out to her. "You dropped this." Sloane snatched it and left. And Cordelia's was very quiet, and Vanessa Prescott stood in the middle of the restaurant that had been her birthright, with a stranger's kindness ringing in her ears, and a heavy-set woman weeping softly at table 9. And for the first time in her entire life, she had stood exactly where she had spent years putting other people. "Thank you," she said to Eli. She could barely look at him, even after how at the loading dock. "I was the one who—" "I know who you were," Eli said. He handed her a clean side towel for the mess. "The question is who you are going to be." And he went back to work, because the floor still needed bussing, and dignity, he had learned, was mostly just the willingness to do the next needed thing. Vanessa went to table 9, and she knelt down, and she apologized to the heavy-set woman, and she meant it. And she cried a little while she did it, and the woman, who had a good heart, ended up comforting her. That night Vanessa did not weep in the walk-in. She sat on an upturned crate in the alley, where the sodium light buzzed, and she thought about her father, and about the man in the canvas coat she had pointed at and laughed. And she did not have a name yet for what she was feeling. But it was the thing that comes right before a person changes for good. Her brother felt nothing of the kind. Her brother had decided that if he could not own Cordelia's, then no one would. Before the sabotage there was the slander, because a man like Brad always reaches for a person's reputation before he reaches for anything harder to break. He had studied the floor long enough to know that Grace Monroe was the beam the whole building rested on. And he decided that if he could not own the restaurant, he could at least pull down the one person holding it up. He chose a Friday, the busiest night of the week, when the dining room was full and a food critic from the Tribune was rumored to be at table 6. He waited until the room was at its loudest, and then he stood up from Walter's old table by the window, and he raised his voice so that it carried into every corner of Cordelia's. "My wallet is gone," Brad announced. "There were $900 in it an hour ago, and now it is gone, and the only person who came near my jacket was her." He pointed across the room at Grace. "The manager, search her. Search the office. I want the police, and I want them now because I will not sit in my own family's restaurant and be robbed by the help." The room went still. Forks lowered. Grace stood at the host stand with 200 people turning to look at her, and the blood left her face, because she knew exactly how this worked, knew that an accusation in a full room does not need to be true to end a career, knew that a manager suspected of theft does not manage anywhere in this city again. She thought of her mother in the chemotherapy chair. She thought of the $11,400 and the tuition and the shifts nobody else would take. And she felt the whole fragile structure of her life tilt toward the floor, the way a tray of china tilts the instant before it falls. "I did not touch your jacket," she said quietly. Her voice was steady even though nothing else in her was. "Of course you would say that," Brad said, warming to it now, playing the whole room. "People like you always say that. Empty your pockets. Let everyone see." And Grace, because she had nothing to hide and everything to lose, began to reach for her apron pocket with shaking hands, ready to turn herself out like a suspect in front of the critic and the regulars and the entire staff she was supposed to lead. "You will do no such thing." Eli crossed the dining room. He was the owner now, whatever that word meant to a man who had slept 9 blocks south of here, and he stood between Grace and the pointing finger the same way he had stood between Vanessa and the dropped glove, and he did not raise his voice, which made the whole room lean in to hear him. "Nobody empties their pockets in this restaurant on the word of a man who has sent back 40 plates in 2 weeks and tipped a folded dollar on everyone," Eli said. "But you want this settled in front of everyone, so we will settle it in front of everyone." He turned to the young man at the podium. "Pull the register count from 6 o'clock and pull the camera on the coat check and put it right here on the table where the gentleman can see it." Because Walter Prescott, even gone, was still everywhere in that building. He had put a camera on the coat check years ago, and he had drilled into every manager the same iron habit: count the drawer at the top of every hour and initial the slip, and Grace had counted it at 6, exactly as he had taught her. The slip was initialed. The drawer was correct to the penny. $4,217.83, not a dollar of it missing. And the camera showed the coat check the whole evening, and it showed no one near Brad's jacket but Brad himself, who at 7:52 had reached into his own coat and slipped his own wallet into his own trouser pocket before standing up to accuse the woman across the room. The building manager set the tablet on the linen and turned it around so the nearest tables could see, and the silence that followed was the worst sound Brad had ever heard, because it was the sound of 200 strangers understanding him all at once. "Your wallet," Eli said, "is in your right trouser pocket. It has been there since 7:52. He let that sit. You just tried to end a woman's life over $900 you were sitting on the whole time. A woman whose mother is in a hospital bed across town fighting for her life." He shook his head slowly. "I have met a lot of people at the bottom of things, Mr. Prescott. I never met one as poor as you." Brad's hand went to his pocket and found the wallet exactly where the camera said it was, and for one instant, one single instant, something flickered across his face that might have been shame. Then it closed over again, the way water closes over a stone, and he threw down his napkin and walked out into the cold without a word, and the dining room slowly, table by table, began to breathe again. Grace made it to the walk-in cooler before her legs gave out. She sat down on a crate of romaine in the cold white hum of it and put her face in her hands and shook, and that was where Vanessa found her a minute later. And Vanessa, who a month before would have stepped over this exact woman on this exact floor, sat down on the crate beside her and put an arm around her and said nothing at all, because she had finally learned that there are moments a person does not need words, only the plain animal comfort of not being left alone in the cold. When Grace could speak again, she wiped her eyes and stood and squared the manager's blazer on her shoulders and walked back out to the floor. Because table 6 still needed running, and the critic was still watching in dignity. She had learned from a man in a canvas coat was mostly just the willingness to do the next needed thing. That should have been the end of it. But Brad did not go home to lick a wound and disappear. Brad went home to plan something worse. Because a man who has just been humiliated in front of 200 people does not grow humble. He grows dangerous. The plan Brad built was patient, and it was ugly. If the restaurant thrived, the year would end and the will would stand, and he would spend the rest of his life as a footnote in a business that carried his own name. So the restaurant could not be allowed to thrive. He would drive it into the ground, force it into bankruptcy or closure, and then, with the accounts thawed and the empire in ruins, he would buy back the wreckage for pennies and be the owner after all. He started with the health department. He made the call from a burner phone in the parking garage. A handkerchief pressed over the mouthpiece, and he reported in a voice full of civic concern that he had eaten at Cordelia's and found a cockroach in his bisque, that the kitchen was filthy, that the staff were rude, that somebody official really ought to come and look. He gave the address. He hung up smiling. "If I cannot have it," he said to the empty concrete, "then it belongs to no one." What he did not know was that his sister had followed him down to the garage. Vanessa had seen him slip out during the lull, and something in the way he moved had turned her cold. And she stood now behind a pillar and heard the whole thing. The handkerchief voice, the cockroach, the address. When he ended the call, she stepped out, and her face was white. "What are you doing?" she said. Brad did not even flinch. "I made a courtesy call," he said. "Several guests have mentioned pests. I merely passed it along. You will get it shut down." She could hardly get the words out, Brad. "If it closes, you do not get it either. The accounts stay frozen. You lose too." "I do not care," Brad said, and for the first time she saw the whole of it, the thing under the smile. "I will not spend one more day as a servant in a building with my own name on it, while a vagrant and a waitress play at running my father's company. If it burns, it burns. I am willing to lose everything to make sure they lose it first." "You are insane," Vanessa whispered. And here was the moral hinge of the thing. The choice her father had gone into the ground, praying she would one day be capable of making. Because Vanessa Prescott could have walked away. She could have kept her head down and finished her year and inherited nothing but her freedom. Warning them cost her everything, her brother, her name, the last person on earth who shared her blood, and her memories of a mother neither of them had gotten to keep long enough. Blood should have counted for something. It was the only currency she had left. She went upstairs and she found Grace in the office counting linens, and she stood in the doorway and could not speak for a moment, and then she said, "My brother called the health inspector. He faked a complaint. Roaches. He is trying to get you closed so the company fails and he can buy it back cheap. I heard him do it, just now in the garage." Grace set down the linens very slowly. "Are you sure?" she said. "I am sure," Vanessa said. And then, absurdly, she began to cry, because saying it out loud had made it real, had made her a person who chose a stranger's restaurant over her own brother. "I only wanted," she said. "I do not even know. I did not want anyone to get hurt." Grace crossed the room and did something no one had done to Vanessa Prescott in a very long time. She put a hand on her shoulder. "You just did the hardest thing you have ever done," Grace said. "Do not be ashamed of it." Then she went to warn Eli, and to make sure that when the inspector came, there would not be a single surface in that kitchen you could not eat off of. The warning came from another direction too, and Grace did not understand it until much later. That evening, a folded slip of paper appeared under the office door, in a hand she did not recognize, small and precise. It said only this: "Watch the walk-in cooler tomorrow before the inspection. He is not finished," and it was not signed. Grace turned it over twice and found nothing, and she put it in her blazer pocket, and she was in the kitchen at 6 the next morning because of it, which was how she caught him. Inspector Dale Brenner arrived at 10:47 on a Wednesday, a neat, unhurried man with a laminated badge and a clipboard, and he asked for the owner, and Grace brought Eli out from the back in a clean chef's coat that Sal had insisted he wear. Brenner explained that the department had received an anonymous complaint. Poor hygiene, and, he said, consulting the clipboard with the ghost of a frown, defects with legs in the final course. Defects with legs, Eli repeated, keeping his face very still. I do not know who called that in, but please, walk the whole kitchen. Open every door. And while Brenner snapped on a glove, Grace was watching the walk-in, just as the note had told her, and she saw Brad drift toward it with something cupped in his hand, something small, and she was across the kitchen before he reached the door. She caught his wrist. In his palm, in a little twist of plastic, were 3 dead roaches he had bought God knows where, ready to be scattered on a prep tray the moment the inspector turned his back. Give me your hand, Brad said, wrenching free. That soup was already ruined. Everyone saw Vanessa botched it. He was loud, too loud, performing for the inspector. Inspector Brenner turned around. He was a man who had seen every kind of restaurant in 22 years. The clean and the filthy and the desperate. And he had also, it turned out, seen every kind of sabotage. And he looked at the young man in the doorway of the walk-in with the plastic twist in his fist. And he understood the entire situation in about 4 seconds. Son, Brenner said, open your hand. What happened next happened fast. Grace had already flagged the building manager, and the building manager had already pulled the kitchen security footage on his tablet. And there on the little screen, in grainy silver, was Bradford Prescott planting a foreign object on the prep line at 6:52 that morning, and doing it again on Tuesday and on Monday. Brenner watched 30 seconds of it. Then he clicked his pen. The kitchen is immaculate, he said to Eli. Cleanest walk-in on the avenue. He looked at Brad. Filing a false public health report is a misdemeanor in this state. Tampering to cause a business economic harm is not. You are going to want a lawyer. And he made a note, and he kept the footage. And he left, and the machinery of consequence, slow and grinding and utterly indifferent to the Prescott name, began to turn. Brad, Grace said quietly, when the inspector had gone. Go home. Whatever home you have left. You are done here. But Brad was already gone, out the service door into the cold. And he was not finished, because a man like Brad is never finished until the thing is taken out of his hands entirely. There was one thing in the Prescott empire worth more than the leases and the chandeliers and the name over the door. And that was the ledger. Walter had kept it his whole life, a heavy leather book of recipes written in his own hand, gram by gram, the short rib that had made them famous, the sourdough starter he had carried from the bus station diner, the bisque, the sauces, 40 years of a man's palate committed to paper. It lived in the vault downstairs, and in the chaos after the funeral, in the shuffle of new management learning old locks, Brad still knew the one combination his father had trusted him with years before and never thought to change. He took the ledger on a Sunday night, and on Monday he sat across a white tablecloth from Marcus Vaughn. Vaughn ran a glass tower of a restaurant 3 blocks north, a man with 2 Michelin stars and a third one that had eluded him for a decade, and an appetite for other people's secrets that was practically famous in the city. He turned the leather book over in his manicured hands and his eyes went hungry. How much? Vaughn said. $500,000, Brad said. In cash. These are the recipes that built the most celebrated kitchen in Chicago. My father wrote every one of them himself. You will quadruple that in a year. He leaned in. And you will finally bury the place that has been beating you for a decade, because I am going to hand you the reason it wins. Vaughn tapped the cover. I do not pay until I taste, he said. Bring me the book. I put my people on 3 dishes tonight, and if they are what you say, you walk out with the cash tomorrow. Done, Brad said. We have a deal. He should have felt triumph. He felt something closer to fever. He went to Cordelia's that night to celebrate the coming ruin of it, and he ordered a bottle of the good brandy and 2 glasses, and made Vanessa bring them. And he lifted the first glass toward his sister with a smile like a wound. To family, he said. What did you do? Vanessa said. She had seen his face. She had learned this last month to read faces. I freed us, Brad said. By this time tomorrow, the only thing that place will be famous for is being robbed. He drank. You could have grown with me, you know. I gave you the chance. You chose the mop. But across the city, at that very hour, Marcus Vaughn was standing in his own gleaming kitchen with the leather ledger open on the pass and a look of dawning fury on his face, because his sous chefs had cooked 3 dishes exactly to the page, gram by gram, and every one of them had come out wrong. The short rib was leaden, the bisque was flat, the sourdough would not rise. Vaughn flipped through the book again and saw it now, the tiny inconsistencies, the temperatures that were off by 15 degrees, the missing ingredient in every list, the whole thing salted with just enough error to be worthless. Because Walter Prescott had never been a fool. The real recipes had never lived in that book at all. The book in the vault was a decoy he had written and rewritten for 20 years. A trap for exactly the kind of man who would try to steal it. And the true ledger, the one that mattered, had only ever lived in one place, which was the head of the man everyone believed was dead. Vaughn called Brad at 7 the next morning. "You lied to me," he said, and his voice was cold enough to frost the phone. "This is garbage. This is a fraud. You tried to sell me a fake, and you are going to regret it more than you have ever regretted anything." Brad's world began very quietly to come apart. He went to Cordelia's because he did not know where else to go, and he found the dining room half full for lunch, and Grace at the host stand, and Vanessa on the floor, and he stood in the doorway with the useless ledger under his arm and something breaking behind his eyes. "You," he said to Grace, "this is your doing. You poisoned him against all of us, you and that vagrant." And Grace looked at him with what was almost pity and said, "No, Brad, this one is all yours." And that was the moment the kitchen door swung open, and a server came out carrying a single bowl of tomato bisque on a tray, and set it down at the corner table by the window, Walter's table, in front of a broad and unhurried old man who had been sitting there quietly for 10 minutes with his back to the room. The man tasted the bisque. He nodded slowly, the way a craftsman nods at his own work. Then he turned around. "Hello, Bradford," said Walter Prescott. The ledger slid from under Brad's arm and hit the floor. "Dad," Vanessa said. Her voice was a child's voice. "Dad," Walter stood. He was thinner than he had been, and grayer, but he was unmistakably alive. And the dining room had gone so silent that the pianist stopped mid-phrase, and the whole city seemed to hold outside the windows. "You are dead," Brad said. His mouth was working. "I was there, your heart, the floor. I was there." "You were there," Walter agreed quietly. "You were on your knees beside me, and do you remember what you said?" He let the question sit. "You did not say hold on. You did not say I love you. You went through my pockets for the combination to the vault, while you thought your father was dying in your arms. That is the last thing you ever said to me, Bradford. Give me the numbers and then you can go." Brad had no answer. There was no answer. Eleanor Prine came forward from the corner where she had been sitting unnoticed, and beside her the building manager with his tablet, and Inspector Brenner in a plain coat, and it unfolded then the way Walter had built it to unfold, layer by patient layer. The heart attack had been real enough to frighten a lesser heart, a stress event his cardiologist had warned him of for years, but he had not died. And in the ambulance, lucid and heartbroken, he had made a decision. He had let them believe it. He had signed a false death into being with the help of one attorney and one doctor and the airtight authority of his own estate. And he had gone to ground in a rented apartment across the street with a pair of binoculars and the security feed piped to a laptop. And for 1 month he had watched his children with the last hope a father has, which is not that his child is good, but that his child can still become good. "Only one of you passed," Walter said. He looked at Vanessa, and his eyes filled. "You warned them, Vanessa. You lost your brother to protect a stranger's kitchen. I watched you kneel down and apologize to a woman you would have mocked a month ago. That was the note under your door, Grace." He turned to Grace Monroe. "I could not let him hurt what you were building." Grace pressed her hand to her mouth. "And the recipes," Walter said, turning at last fully to his son. "The book you sold to Marcus Vaughn for $500,000 was a forgery I have been writing for 20 years. I wondered someday which of my children would try to steal it." He shook his head slowly. "I hoped it would be neither. I am so sorry, Bradford. Somewhere along the way I gave you everything a boy could want and forgot to give you the one thing that mattered, and you are what I made." Brad did not fall to his knees and repent. That is not how it happens with men like Brad, and Walter knew it, and the story does not pretend otherwise. What Brad did was smile that terrible smile one last time and say, "So you faked your own death to teach me a lesson. That is not love, old man. That is a sickness, and you are calling me the monster." He was still certain, even then, even standing in the ruins of it, that the mistake was everyone else's. That was the tragedy of him. A man can lose everything and still, for a long time, refuse to learn the one thing losing it was meant to teach. But the world had stopped waiting for Brad to agree with it. Inspector Brenner filed his report. Marcus Vaughn, humiliated and out nothing but his pride, since he had wisely never paid, filed his own complaint the moment he learned. The seller had also stolen the book, and the theft of the ledger from the vault was grand theft, and the attempt to sell proprietary recipes was theft of trade secrets, and the false health report was a misdemeanor, and the sabotage caught on 3 days of security footage was criminal mischief in the aim of economic harm. The district attorney's office, which did not care in the slightest that the defendant's last name was on a building, brought all of it. And in the discovery that followed, the forensic accountants Eleanor Prine had quietly retained found the rest. The vendor accounts Brad had been skimming for 2 years, the invoices he had forged, the supplier kickbacks he had buried in the catering books, while his father was alive and trusting. Bradford Prescott pleaded out to avoid a trial he could not win. He served 14 months. His trust, thawed at last by the completion of a will he had spent so much energy fighting, went almost entirely to lawyers and restitution. When he walked out the far side of it, he had no money and no name worth trading on, and no father willing to open a door, because Walter had decided, with the hardest love he had ever spent, that this time the boy would not be rescued. This time the boy would have to find the bottom on his own. And he did. He found it the way Eli had once found it, on the cold side of the doors he used to sneer at, learning the exact weight of $1 and the exact temperature of a January sidewalk, learning at 35 what his father had learned at 19, and had spent a fortune making sure his children never would. It took the better part of a year. But somewhere in that year, on some night we are not shown, Bradford Prescott finally stopped believing the mistake belonged to everyone else. Life at Cordelia's went on, and it changed, and the changing was the best revenge anyone could have asked for, because it was not revenge at all. Walter did not take the empire back. He had learned something in that rented room across the street, watching through the binoculars, and what he had learned was that a man could love a thing so much he strangled it, and he did not intend to strangle this. He kept the ledger, the real one, the one that had always lived in his head, and he spent his mornings in the kitchen teaching it to Eli one dish at a time, gram by gram. The short rib and the sourdough and the bisques, because a recipe you cannot pass on dies with you, and Walter Prescott was done letting things die to prove a point. Grace Monroe ran the floor and then the restaurant, and then, within 2 years, the whole group. She turned out to have the thing that cannot be taught. The thing Walter had it and his children had not, which was that she knew everyone's name and everyone's children's names, and which line cook was 1 bad week from going under. She started a fund in the company's name, and the first check it ever cut paid off $11,400 in hospital bills for a woman undergoing chemotherapy, and the second paid the spring tuition for a young man named Cole who would go on to manage the second location. Grace's mother rang the bell at the end of her treatment on a Tuesday in April, and the whole staff of Cordelia's was there in the hospital lobby to hear it. And Walter stood at the back, with his hat in his hands, and wept for reasons that had nothing to do with the woman ringing the bell, and everything to do with the one he had lost 11 years before, who had made him promise, and whose promise he had finally, fully kept. Eli Turner never did get comfortable being called an owner. But he got comfortable being useful, which is a better thing. He hired from the shelter 9 blocks south. He kept a pot of soup on at the back door, and he served it himself in a clean chef's coat to anyone who asked, and he never once asked them what had gone wrong in their lives to bring them there, because he knew from the inside that the question is a cruelty and the soup is a kindness, and a person can only carry one of those at a time. Vanessa stayed. Nobody made her. Her year had long since ended, and her name was clear, and she could have walked into any life she wanted, and instead she asked Grace to teach her the floor the right way, from the bottom. And she turned out to be good at it, better than good, because she had finally been on both sides of the tray, and she never forgot the second side. She was the one who insisted the heavyset regular, the one she had humiliated, be comped a dessert every single visit for the rest of her life, and she delivered it herself every time, and the two of them became, improbably, something like friends. And then one gray morning in the following winter, almost exactly 2 years after a big man in a canvas coat had come in from the cold, the service door opened, and a man stood in it, turning a cap in his hands. He was thinner, his good suit was long gone. He wore a second-hand coat gone shiny at the elbows, and there was gray in his hair that had not been there before, and he stood in the doorway of the restaurant that carried his name, and could not, for a long moment, make himself come in. Vanessa saw him first. She set down her tray. "Brad," she said. He looked at her, and his face was not the face from before. The smile was gone. What had replaced it was not yet peace, but it was the raw and humbled thing that has to come before peace, the face of a man who has finally run out of people to blame. "I am not here for anything," he said quickly, the words coming out rough, like he had practiced them on the train and still not gotten them right. "I know I do not get to ask for anything. He stopped. He started again. "I spent a long time trying to figure out whose fault it was." He looked down at the cap in his hands. "It took me until this winter to understand it was mine. Dad tried to give me everything so I would never be cold, and I turned into a man who laughed at people who were. I laughed at the one who is standing in this kitchen right now because he was kind to me first." He looked at Eli, who had come out from the back. "I am sorry," he said, "to you most of all. I do not expect you to believe it, I would not." The kitchen was silent. And then Walter Prescott came out from the back, older and slower, wiping his hands on his apron, and he stood in front of the son he had buried alive to save. And the two of them looked at each other across a distance that no amount of money had ever been able to close, and that had, somehow, in the losing of all that money, finally begun to. "I do not have money to give you," Walter said, "and even if I did, I would not, because the money is what broke you, and I am not going to hand you the thing that broke you and call it love." His voice caught. "But if you want to work, if you want to start where every person in this room started, which is the bottom, and learn what $1 weighs, and what a plate costs, and what a person is worth, which is the same whether they are eating at the window or asking at the back door." He held out his hand. "Then you start today." Brad looked at the hand, then he took it. "Sal," Walter said, without turning around, his eyes still on his son and shining. "Get him an apron." By the host stand, framed in plain black, hung a single sheet of paper the staff walked past 100 times a day. It was the note that had appeared under Grace's door before the inspection, the one that had saved everything, written in an old man's careful hand. "Watch the walk in cooler tomorrow. He is not finished." Walter had it framed not as a warning but as a reminder, because he said a family is not the people who share your blood or your name or your fortune. A family is the people who warn you when you cannot see the danger yourself, and stand between you and the cold, and hand you a plate when you have no way to pay for it. "I spent my whole life," Walter told his children once, near the end of a long service, thinking the measure of a man was what he could put on the table. It is not. It is whether he can look at the person who cleared it and see somebody exactly as real as himself. True wealth was never the chandeliers, or the leases, or the name over the door. It was the moment a proud man knelt down to apologize to someone he had wronged, and meant it. It was a bowl of soup handed across a loading dock to a stranger in the cold. It was learning, however late, however hard, to look at every single person who passes through your life as an equal, because in every way that will ever matter in the end, they are. Dignity is not a privilege, it is a basic right.